What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to Strength Coach Rants. I'm your host, Connor Lyons, and today we're going to be talking about ankle tape and something called the joint-by-joint approach.
It's all my head, now stuck in the void again.
All right, so welcome back. I think it's been like 2 weeks. We've been a little bit spotty with some of the episode drops. Some weeks you've gotten two, some weeks you've gotten none. But for the most part, we try to keep up. We just got a lot of things going on right now and something big in the works. And if it ends up working out, it's going to be a really big deal. And I think everyone involved will be happy. It's just time intensive and there's a lot of details to iron out and everything. But that's why you're not getting episodes every week. So here we are. Hopefully we'll get one next week, but it may be that we take our little summer break a little bit earlier this year, just with everything going on. But I'll try my best to keep kind of doing some episodes. But we're here to talk about ankle tape today and the what's called the joint-by-joint approach, or what I call the joint stacks model. It's made quote-unquote famous. It's very loosely using that term very loosely. I don't know that it's very famous, but it was made famous and well known by Mike Boyle, who's a strength and conditioning coach who's been in the field for like a billion years. He was one of the functional gurus 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's probably closer to 20 years ago at this point. Him and Gray Cook, the FMS guy, they were very much into the quote-unquote functional type of training. Mike Boyle's a guy who doesn't want his athletes to back squat because he thinks a front squat is better, and a Bulgarian squat has more carryover than a typical back squat. A lot of things I disagree with him on, but he's been doing it for a long time, so whatever. We listen to him because he's kind of been there and done it, and he was absolutely right with the way he kind of laid this out. And it's called the joint-by-joint approach. And essentially, what it does is it lays out that our body is just a series of joints stacked on top of each other that kind of operate independently but have effects on the joints above and below them. So within our body, you think of the joints, right? Like your ankle, your knee, your hip, your shoulder, your elbow, all that stuff. We're not talking about the individual joints because like your quote-unquote foot joint has like 10, 15 different joints in it. We're just talking about like the collective unit of what we would consider the joint, because a joint is anywhere where two bones connect. So you've got tons of them throughout your body. But we're going to talk about like the way that they function on top of each other and how having something lacking in one joint is going to affect the other all the way up the kinetic chain. So we will get into the ankle tape, but this kind of lays the whole foundation for why the ankle tape matters. So if you're here for the ankle tape question, I promise you we'll get there. We're just going to go over this real quick first. All right, so if you're not watching, you're listening, this is a little graphic I created that shows the body, and then it has every major joint and its functionality. So each joint is going to do one of two things. It's either going to be mobile or it's going to be stable, and those joint functions alternate as we go up the kinetic chain, meaning like up your body. So we're going to start off with the foot. Now you can probably think in your head, the foot's a very stable joint, right? It doesn't move all that much. You can kind of pull your toes up and push them down. It doesn't really rotate or do much else. It really doesn't move much at all. And this is like not a design flaw. That's the way it's supposed to be, because every ounce of force that you produce is going to have to go through your foot into the ground so that you can propel yourself forward. So if it wasn't a stable joint, we would be susceptible to injury and sports probably wouldn't exist. So very important that that joint is stable. Your ankle, very mobile, right? Your ankle's a lot like your wrist. It can do a whole lot of stuff. It can go up, down. It can go left, right. It can do what feels like rotation, but we call it inversion, eversion, dorsiflexion, and plantar flexion. That means up, down, and then kind of like that. That's what the ankle does. Very, very mobile joint, or at least it's meant to be. The knee, right after the ankle, we have our knee, which is very stable. It flexes and extends. It's what we call a hinge joint. It just kind of goes up and down. Like you can kick your leg straight and then bend it. There's also some internal and external rotation that takes place between the tibia and the femur, but it's pretty minuscule and it's not really considered its like primary function. So for the purpose of this, we call it a hinge joint. We say it flexes and extends, and that's pretty much it. All right, your hip is next, and our hips, although today are not very mobile because of the lifestyles that we live or lead, where we're sitting most of the day, our hips are meant to be very mobile. Right? It's a ball and socket joint. It can adduct, abduct, flex, extend, rotate internally and externally. So it's got a lot of functions. It does many things, or it's meant to be. But again, today, we deal with a lot of joint dysfunction when it comes to the hip, and we'll talk about what that leads to in a couple minutes here. But just know that it's meant to be a very mobile joint. Then we get into our lumbar spine, which is very stable for the most part. It really just flexes and extends. There's a little bit of rotation, but that's not really its job. The thoracic spine comes next. That comes above our lumbar spine. That's like the upper part of like your torso. So like think lumbar spine is low back. Thoracic spine is torso. It's a very mobile joint. It flexes, extends, it rotates. It's meant to do a lot of movement. When you go to rotate with your body or with your, grab something across your body, that's really your thoracic spine that's supposed to be doing that. And again, we'll talk about how that's not always the case. Then we have our SC joint, our scapulothoracic joint. So your thoracic rib cage, like the ribs that come off that part of, I guess that's all your ribs. And then your scapula sits on top of it. And this is, although meant to be somewhat of a mobile joint, it is really built for stability. It should be able to, depress and elevate. It should, have some adduction, abduction, but for the most part, it's a fairly stable joint. It doesn't move all that much. It doesn't do all that much. Then we have our GH joint. That's our glenohumeral joint. That's where your glenoid and your humerus meet, right? So that's like your actual shoulder joint. When you think of your shoulder, that's what it is. It's meant to be very mobile. It's a ball and socket joint, just like the hip. It adducts, abducts, internally, externally rotates, flexes, extends, does a whole bunch of stuff. Then we get to the elbow. That's the knee of the upper body, right? It's a hinge joint. It flexes and extends. It also does some internal and external rotation. We don't really get any add or abduction out of our elbow, but you do get some rotation at the radius there. So there is some movement that isn't just flexing and extending, but for the most part, it's a very stable joint. It doesn't move all that much. Then we get to the wrist, which is like the ankle of the upper body. And again, if you're watching, you can see. If you're not watching, I'm just kind of rotating my hand all around. It extends, it flexes, it adducts, abducts, and there's even like a little bit of what you could consider internal, external rotation. Then we get to the hand. The hand's a very stable joint, just like the foot, because our hands do deal with a lot of force as well. When we grab things, when we throw things, when we fall and we catch ourselves, lots of force there. All right, so why is all this important? Why is understanding the actual roles of the joint, why is that important? Well, because when we lack something at one joint, we're going to gain it at the next one, right? So if you think, like, let's say this is a perfect example, and probably 90% of you can relate to this in some fashion. My hips get really tight, right? I've got very tight hips. All of a sudden, I develop back pain. If you've ever been to a chiropractor and got an adjustment, and you're like, man, my back really hurts. I don't know what's causing it, and they may say, well, your hamstrings are tight, right? That's a very common reason for, quote unquote, reason for low back pain. It's not usually the hamstrings. It's usually a host of things, but your hips being tight, or muscles that act at the hip being tight, can absolutely cause low back pain, because what it's going to do is it's going to cause more movement in your lumbar spine than they're supposed to be. If I have to perform a task where I have to use my hips and my hips aren't mobile enough to perform that task, where do you think that movement's going to come from? Well, there's two places. It can either come from the knee, or chances are it's going to come from the back. And we know this, or you probably know this without knowing that you know it, because you've always heard people tell you to lift with your legs, not with your back, right? So we don't want that movement to come from our back. We want it to come from our hips, because that's what they're designed to do. But when we don't have that movement in our hips, all of a sudden now it's got to come from somewhere, and it's probably going to come from the back. Now, it's just for your kind of general person, general population type person. When it comes to athletes, sometimes that movement's going to come from the knee, right? So we have epidemics of like ACL tears and MCL tears and meniscus tears and all these other things, and a lot of that comes from the hips. But and we're going to talk about where else it comes from next. But just understand, if I have a joint that's supposed to be very mobile and it's not mobile, I am going to gain some of that from the next joint above or below it, depending on what I'm trying to do. If I'm walking, it may come from my knee joint. If I'm bending down and picking something up, it may come from my lumbar spine, right? And that can happen all the way up the chain. So my tight hips can end up causing tight shoulders in some respects. It's wild. I was at USF working with the baseball team, and we had a kid blow his UCL out, and they theorized that it actually came from some instability in his foot. Just caused problems all up the chain and went undiagnosed. It went unlooked at. It went ununderstood, misunderstood, not understood at all. And he ended up blowing out his UCL and needed Tommy John surgery. So if you are a baseball player, that's a good kind of thing to think about. Are you lacking mobility or gaining stability at certain joints? It can absolutely have an effect on what's happening at your elbow. A lot of that too, obviously overuse, but there can be some instability issues in the SC joint, your scapulothoracic joint, that can cause tightness in the shoulder, which is now going to cause you to gain that movement at your elbow. So not good to have these, kind of lacking mobility where we need it or gaining mobility where we shouldn't have it. It can cause issues all the way up the chain. So I'm going to kind of dismiss that graphic now that you see it. So where does ankle tape fall in, right? So ankle tape, I have my ankle. It's meant to be very mobile, right? What happens when I put ankle tape on my ankle? It gets very stable, right? So now I have to move in a manner where I'm going to sprint up the field or cut to change direction, and I no longer have an ankle that can do the things that I need it to do. Where do you think that movement comes from, right? More than likely the knee. And I think not like there's a lot of reasons why we have this epidemic of ACL issues, but ankle tape is absolutely one of them. Taping up your ankles and fixating them in a position that's not going to allow them to be as mobile as they need to be will absolutely cause you to gain some mobility in your knee, which can be disastrous, especially if you're not strong enough, just like many of the overtrained, over-skill trained athletes that we have who aren't nearly strong enough to play and recover from the sports that they play. So ankle tape, not necessarily the best thing. Now, I'm not saying that you should never use ankle tape. If let's say you sprain your ankle and there's like 3 games left in the season, you got to get out there. You got to win this game to make it to the playoffs or do whatever. That's fine. Put the ankle tape on, play, fight through it, deal with it. But this prophylactic, I'm not injured and I'm wearing ankle tape, like that's got to stop because it's not necessary for one. It's a waste of money. It's also a waste of your athletic trainer's time. And it's putting you in a position to potentially get hurt, right? So I'm not an absolutist. I don't think that there is never a time or a place to put ankle tape or an ankle brace on. I just think if you are somebody who has quote unquote weak ankles, you need to be put on an ankle strengthening routine while you're using this ankle tape in an effort to make your ankle strong enough to not need the tape, right? So the ultimate goal of ankle tape would be to not ever have to use it again so that we can not deal with some of the knee issues that we have, right? And so let's say ankle tape on the ankle. Now my ankle is more stable. My knee becomes a little bit more mobile. Now my hip becomes a little bit more stable, right? Maybe that leads to, and this is like pie in the sky, this could happen. It doesn't mean it's going to happen if you use ankle tape. It's just a could happen over time kind of thing. But labral tears in your hip, it could end up causing you back issues. It could end up causing you some neck pain because you wanted to put ankle tape on. And that's, there are a lot of coaches. My old boss was a wide receiver at USF at UF. He was a blocking receiver. He was there back when like Chris Leak played. So we're talking, guys, 15, 16 years ago now. But you had to wear ankle tape. They had like preventative ankle tape is what they called it. So you had to put it on. If you did not have ankle tape out on the field, you had to do extra conditioning. So what him and a lot of the other guys would do, because they kind of were going through exercise science and athletic training programs, was they just got some pre-wrap and they got some tape and they put it right to the top of their ankle and didn't end up wrapping it around their foot. So it looked like they had ankle tape on, but they didn't, right? So I know spat looks cool, right? You want to put the Power Flex on the outside of your shoe. That Power Flex isn't doing much, so maybe spat is okay in some instances. But for the most part, you don't need it. And then another thing that ankle tape does, so the most common mechanism for injury as far as like rolling your ankle goes is to invert the foot, right, and tear what's called your ATF, or man, I'm anterior talofibula. Man, I'd have to look that up. I probably should have done that before I started this episode. But your ATF ligament, that's the most commonly torn one, and it's basically your ankle going down and doing this number. You roll it to the outside, right? That's the most common way to kind of tear your or to sprain your ankle rather. So what we end up doing is we take this tape and we put you into crazy forced eversion, right? So what that eversion does is instead of like your foot being like this, is now it's like this. The other way. You end up flat-footed, and again, this is going to have all kinds of like issues all the way up the chain. If I'm flat-footed, I'm more likely to internally rotate my hip, which means I'm more likely to tear my ACL when I go to change direction. It's not only keeping you from moving in a manner that's going to be like keeping you healthy, it's physically putting you in a position to hurt yourself. All right, so unless we really, really need ankle tape, we're talking sprained my ankle in the middle of a game and I got to get out there, so let's do this, put that ankle tape on so I can keep playing. Unless we're talking about that, and unless we're talking about putting you on a legitimate recovery plan and ankle strengthening routine, right, then we need to maybe forego the ankle tape because it's just not worth it, right? You just put yourself in too many positions to be able to get hurt, and it is not worth it, especially if you don't need it. All right. So it was quick. It was short and sweet today. I just wanted to talk about that. I had a couple athletes. I actually have two right now who are off playing in other places who are dealing with some ankle issues now. They're kind of near the end of their seasons, and hopefully we'll be able to fix some of that when they come back. But we're asking about wearing braces and taping, and it's always a hard conversation because if it's something they're used to and something they like to do, then it's really hard to say, hey, you've been doing this all this time, do this instead, and not have it like destroy the way that their brain works when it comes to sports, because we're all very superstitious and we get in our heads when things aren't exactly the way that they're supposed to be. So I say I'm no longer an athlete, but back when I played, I was that way. So that's it for today. Hopefully you learned something. Again, the joint by joint approach, or the joint stacks model, understanding mobility versus stability, alternating all the way up the chain, and how a problem in your foot can cause an issue with your elbow or your neck. And then just understanding that ankle tape's probably something that is better left not part of your pregame rituals than it is having something that you continue to do. So we'll see you next time. Hope you learned something, and everybody have a good weekend.